All right. Good afternoon and welcome to our panel discussing municipal broadband, what hasn't worked and what just might. So we're going to kind of run through today some of the different types of municipal broadband projects that have been out there, kind of how those have been pursued and what the effects have been. And I'm Katie McAuliffe. I'm Executive Director of Digital Liberty. With us today, we have Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform, David Williams, President of the Taxpayer Protection Alliance, Sarah O with the Technology Policy Institute, and George Ford with the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal, Economic, and Public Policy Studies. Full name. So I'm really excited to have you guys here to discuss some of the different implications, talking about broadband. It's very important right now, particularly with a lot of us at home, having to use network connections for work and school, and kind of how we get connected, stay connected with good service throughout the entire country. And one of the things that we talk about are, there are a few things to sort of maybe lay some ground rules on definitions. We talk about adoption, which falls into the category of people who have access to broadband, like could subscribe to broadband if they wanted to, but choose not to adopt broadband. Then we've got other people who are in areas that are completely unserved. They don't have any choices whatsoever. And those choices, now they might have some choices for connectivity that involve satellite, maybe fixed wireless or something along those lines, but they might not be up to the 25 megabit speed that the FCC has defined as broadband. And then we've got other folks who are unserved who also fall into this category, but perhaps don't have, or fall into the category of maybe what slower speeds, and perhaps don't have as many choices for broadband. So we're looking at adoption, who's served, who's underserved. I look at my mobile phone, which is usually about 16 when it comes to the megabits per second that you're dealing with. And I find that to be sufficient, running that as a hotspot or watching video or doing things on my phone. But of course, there are other aspects that we want to go through. So I'd like to kick it off to Grover Norquist to start out kind of talking about the taxpayer implications of municipal broadband, who supports them and why, and maybe some of the failures. So over to you.
Hey, Katie, thank you. Grover Norquist here with American Reform. DC and trying to stop bad ideas. Municipal broadband, a sales pitch to a mayor, a city council, that this is going to make you, if not rich and famous, at least famous, and you can let a lot of contracts. And it's, we've seen this before with light rail, where again and again and again, politicians are told that if they put light rail in, they'll have all these people ride on it, and they never look what happened to the last rail efforts in other cities. And so while we explain to people that the idea that a government monopoly is going to come in and compete with companies that have done this hundreds and hundreds of times around the world, who know what the costs are, the real costs, who know what the problems are, and failures and successes, but on large part in business, they've been succeeding at it, that somehow this particular town or city is going to set up a government. It's as if you had FedEx and then somebody said, let's invent the post office. You wouldn't do it. And yet somehow with light rail, people have been told, just because no one has ever wanted to get out of their car and tear up the streets of the city for months and months and different points, by the time you're finished, who knows if anyone wants to go between those 2 points. And I bring up light rail because the same sort of group of people going around city to city to on, you can do the thing that's never been competently, do the same thing with municipal broadband. And well-meaning elected officials think this is an opportunity to do something, and they don't look at the history. And those of us who would like to see more competent government at the local level and at the regional level, do them a favor when we compile the crash and successes in getting broadband out to the entire country. And somehow setting up a government monopoly is not the way to go. The character in The Music Man, who goes and sells the town on all of this in order to make a few bucks selling instruments that will never be by the children, replicated with companies that set up, that give you the sales pitch and then help you run the campaign to convince the city, the town, that you ought to have municipal broadband. They pocket the cash and then leave the local taxpayers, the local elected officials, with the debt and with the challenges. And the country, with examples like this conversation here is extremely helpful so that we can get to mayors and city council members. Don't make a mistake. Learn from the mistakes. There are ways to expand broadband. Setting up a government monopoly is not one of them. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that kind of rundown as to what is going on, that overview there. And let's kick it over to David Williams to talk about some of the specific cases. You know, Grover gave us a great setting as to how light rail and some of these ideas that maybe nobody really wanted, kind of how do they get legs?
Thanks, Katie. And talking about light rail and trolleys, you know, Grover, that's very dear to my heart because of what's in DC and the ridiculous trolley we have in DC. So that was a great analogy, and you've really got my attention by talking about light rail. So the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, we've been looking at this issue for a number of years, and we have seen these things fail across the country. And of course, when they fail, that means taxpayers fail because these are funded by taxpayers. These systems are funded by taxpayers. So we wanted to look at just if people are subscribing to these services. So you build a GON, a government-owned network. Are people actually subscribing to the broadband, the video, or the phone service? And what we have found is people aren't. And we looked at the take rates of these systems across the country. We looked at 30 of these systems. And basically, our ultimate goal here is to close the digital divide. I think we all agree on that, is we want to close the digital divide. And these municipal broadband networks, they claim to want to do that, but they really aren't. So this report, Gone with the Wind, we wanted to really provide a baseline of information of the actual number of broadband customers and associated broadband penetration rates for a large cross-section of these GONs. And when I talk about a large cross-section, we're looking at cities and municipalities, less than 10,000 people, and over 50 and 60,000, and everything in between, because we want to get a comprehensive look at this. And, you know, Grover mentioned The Music Man, and he's absolutely right. And for you younger folks, probably The Simpsons might be a better example, the monorail episode, where this con man comes into Springfield and promises this big, shiny monorail system. You know, spend lots of money, and he gets the money, the con man gets the money, he leaves, and the city is left with this decrepit monorail system. I mean, the same exact thing is happening with these broadband systems. And this is critically important because these consultants have a lot of sway. When they go into a town, first they charge the city a couple $100,000. So they do a report, and listen, we all know what the report's going to say: build a system. So you have these consultants that really, you know, what I call Jeopardy-based research. They already have the answer. You're just looking for the question at this point. So we wanted to see, okay, these consultants are saying you're going to get a 45, a 60% take rate. So you're going to be financially viable. Everything is going to be wonderful, and you're going to close the digital divide. So what really happened? And, you know, we'll take a look at that. So what we did was we used FOIAs and open records requests to get this information. And a lot of you probably know how difficult it is to squeeze information out of a government. And it was very difficult for us to squeeze this information out of governments. We sent out 30 open records requests. varying degrees of compliance. And just one quick anecdote, the system in South Dakota, we got a very quick response. And it was everything we could ever dream of in a response from a government. No proprietary information, just the information we wanted. 2 weeks later, we get this frantic call from someone inside the government saying, that was a mistake. We weren't supposed to give you all that information. Can you send it back? Well, you really can't unring that bell. So it's the first time in my 27 years in DC that I've gotten too much information from any sort of government entity. So that's what we used. And when we looked at these 30 systems, we didn't want to cherry pick. We didn't want to say, okay, I know that a bunch of these systems have failed, so let's look at their track record. No, we just went around the country and picked 30 systems, regardless of what we knew about them. And a lot of these systems, when we looked at them, I had no idea they existed until we looked at them. So what did we find? Well, this is the fascinating part, that the average broadband penetration for these 30 systems was 37%. So when you have a consultant saying that you're going to get 45 or 60%, the average penetration was 37%, which is anemic, to say the least. And some may be thinking, well, what about smaller communities? That's all the 30. Well, smaller communities, it was even less than that. It was 36%. So not even smaller communities that didn't have many options didn't have a great penetration or take rate. And I think that goes back to what Katie was alluding to earlier, is that some people just don't want the service and they will access the internet in other ways. So I think that just because you're a small community and you don't have a government-owned network doesn't mean it's going to be successful. And another thing to consider is that these take rates are not going to be increasing as time goes on, because we're going to have so many different ways to access the internet, whether it's 5G, and I mean, who knows what's next, what's in 5, 10, 15 years. So when you build a physical system like this, that you are really locking yourself into a technology, and you're locking taxpayers, and in some cases, utility ratepayers, to these really expensive projects. And there's, listen, plenty of range in the penetration rates. Salisbury, North Carolina, 16.7%. You have Muscatine, Iowa with 63%. Now, Salisbury has gotten a lot of publicity, and rightly so, because it's been an absolute failure from top to bottom. And one of the things that I find really interesting about Salisbury is that there's a group called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and they are very much a pro-muni broadband group. And they even warned about consultants coming into Salisbury and selling them snake oil. And again, this is a group that wants to build these systems on the back of taxpayers, so they were skeptical of this consultant. Well, in 2010, Salisbury had to sell their system for pennies on the dollar. And right now, they're just paying interest on the loans and not any principal. Now, remember, this is taxpayer money. So when we talk about just paying interest on the loans, this is money that they took from local taxpayers. And we have Muscatine, Iowa, that has a take rate of 63%. And again, to show that we're not cherry picking, we did find one that, were supposedly doing well, but their financials are a different story, is that they spent $35 million to build this system. Now, they took a loan from the electric utility to do this. And this is another problem we see across the country, is that cities and localities are actually taking money from the utilities and the electric ratepayers to build these systems. And when they go kaput, it's the electric ratepayers that are on the hook. So let's look at that Iowa system, 63%. That means 37% of the people are paying for this and they're not using it. And they are being forced to pay for the system. And this is the same around the country, is you're asking people to pay for a system that they may never use. And the service isn't free. A lot of people think, well, we're going to have a municipal system, so we're going to have a free system. No, you still have to pay for the monthly charge, whether it's $100 or $150, you're still paying the monthly charge. So it's a double whammy on folks in these cities. And basically, I don't want to take too much more time, but this is just a bad investment for cities and localities. And we've seen this time and time again. There was a study a few years ago by the University of Pennsylvania that talked about the finances of these systems. And I think one system wasn't going to be profitable until about 1,000 years. So, I mean, and looking at the take rates, we're seeing why is that people just aren't subscribing to these services. And the fact of the matter is that we have new technology, and not a system that was included is Kentucky Wired. And that's a $300 million fiber ring around the state of Kentucky that they're going to be paying for. And when I say they, the taxpayers of Kentucky are going to be paying for 20 plus years because of the bonds that are associated with it. And this money takes valuable resources away from cities and towns. If you look at what the pandemic is doing, revenues have dropped so much over the past 4 or 5 months. And all of a sudden, you're taking $30 to $40 million out of a local economy to build a system that's going to fail. This money could have gone towards infrastructure. It could have gone towards fire, police, and yet these cities and towns probably will ask Uncle Sam for a bailout. And I guess the last thing I want to say is, these cities and towns don't listen to these consultants. These are paid consultants. They're making a hefty amount of money. Taxpayers, again, are paying for these consultants, $100,000, $200,000 to say, yes, build a system. And here's kind of the weird new twist on this is that some of these consultancies are now building systems, are now getting into the business of building. So obviously a huge conflict of interest when you're bringing a consultant in, but the numbers don't lie. And if you look at what's happening across the country, people are not subscribing to the services. And, I could talk for hours about why they're not, but, it's just you're draining valuable resources away from these cities and from taxpayers. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it just really doesn't seem to make sense to build out a service that's already available. So especially when you're talking about, Kentucky Wired, which is interesting because it's an entire state. A lot of these are cities and towns that are doing this sort of thing. But when you've got viable competition, you've got viable networks that work. It seems like a misdirect of, what should be scarce taxpayer resources and should be directed towards things that are truly of need. And you end up with other situations like iProvo, which I know is old news in the world of broadband, but again, sold for $1 to a private company, and taxpayers are still on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars on down the road, even though the system isn't even owned by the local government anymore. And kicking it over to Sarah, Sarah, a lot of the reasons that people cite for needing these networks are increased adoption or employment opportunities. And you've done a paper kind of looking into that, examining 500 cities and towns that have municipal broadband and what have been the effects of that.
Thanks, Katie. Yes, I agree. There have been projects building out municipal networks in 500 cities. And a magazine called Broadband Communities, lists out the towns and the cities that have built municipal broadband networks. There's also a list by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. So I was interested in doing research to find out, okay, how successful have some of these projects been? And, for some of them that didn't work out, why didn't they work out? And so I did a study, and I took the list of 500 projects that I could find in those two lists. And I searched for each of those towns and cities, the networks in the FCC Form 477 database to find out, what they're self-reporting as the technology they're using, what speeds. The FCC's Form 477 data is self-reported deployment reporting from broadband networks to the FCC. So I did a query and I searched, and out of those 500 networks, I found about 70 that had filed information with the FCC. So then from there, I had this great data set of about 70 towns and cities with municipal networks. And so I started doing an investigation. I took all the employment statistics and demographics for each of those towns. And I did econometric work to find out, did that municipal broadband network have an impact on adoption levels or on employment levels in those places? And so the idea behind my study was, each side can cherry pick, the worst cases or the best cases. And you've seen plenty of those studies that pick out, the success cases and then that pick out like the ultimate failures. But there is like an averaging across all the different places. And so my study is an attempt to look at the empirical record for the whole group, as many as I can put together. And part of the question for municipal broadband build out is it's an endogeneity question. Towns and cities that are growing, that have demand for broadband, might be more likely to have a successful network. So is it really the build out that is creating that growth, or is it the actual town, something else in that town? It could be the age demographics, it could be other sources of business growth. But it's not just that network that's there. And so my study wants to control for those other factors that go into the decision. And so from my study, I use, econometric methods to take out different factors. And I find that, there's no real econometric proof that the presence of a municipal network will lead to higher adoption or higher employment growth. If you take together, all the data from all the towns and you control for the size of the city, the size of the growth rates, I can't find any results. And so this kind of study helps towns and cities who are trying to decide whether to build a municipal network. It helps them have a kind of a clear-eyed view that, well, it works in some places, but it really doesn't in other places. The claims that municipal broadband will definitely lead to growth aren't quite generalizable. And I think people know that, but the study attempts to take as much data as possible to investigate that question.
Great, thanks, Sarah. That's really helpful in, running through those reasons that people look into building networks, why communities might think that those are attractive, something to draw people to the community, but really there are other factors that lead to that. And so I want to kick it over to George to talk to us a bit about, his study. He's done a number of studies on broadband connectivity issues and bridging the digital divide, the cost of broadband. And, we're looking at options for increasing adoption. How do we get there? We've tried municipal broadband. There was the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program, BTOP, which had kind of, I think, spawned a lot of these municipal broadband attempts that landed in utter failure because you've got people who don't understand broadband or understand networks and this technology trying to put those networks together and then keep those networks going. So George, from what you've looked at, what works, what doesn't? Kind of what parts of this do you want to go through?
Thanks, Katie. There'd be a lot to go through if I wanted to do it all. I've written a lot in this area. I've been really doing it for 25 years. And been cited on both sides of the debate. And I've consulted for municipal broadband systems in the past. I'm not opposed to municipal broadband in some general sense. It may make sense in some cases, but most of the systems that are being deployed now are not in that category of the sensible ones, which is basically where there's absolutely no broadband and you're going to have to subsidize it anyway. When talking about municipal broadband, I think it's very important to keep in mind the underlying economics. And I wrote a paper a couple years ago titled "The Impact of Government on Broadband Networks on Private Investment and Consumer Welfare" that goes through a lot of the economics of municipal broadband. And to break it down simply, the issue is why are these systems being built? And the answer is, even by the advocates of municipal broadband, is that the service wouldn't be built if we didn't. Okay, which means the private sector is not going to build it, and if the private sector is not going to build it, the obvious implication is that there's no money in it. And so you just have to understand that when you build a municipal broadband network, you're going to lose money, and you may lose a whole lot of it. And you just have to come at it from that perspective and try to understand it. And when you think about it from that perspective, municipal broadband is not adding competition to the market. It's actually anti-competitive. Their prices are below cost, which is predatory in some circles. So it's just, we're kind of talking past each other a lot of times. I think about it. It's just very important to get the economics. That paper, by the way, is coming out in the Federal Communications Law Journal probably in a month or so, and it's been extended, and there's a legal analysis of municipal broadband that Larry Spywak, the president of the center, put together. It's probably going to be the largest piece and most economically significant piece on municipal broadband to date. At least I hope that's the case. When you take the economics of the broadband business, which is these have to be subsidized networks because the private sector won't build them, all the evidence supports that. I mean, any municipal broadband system you look at is being subsidized in one form or another. Most of the recent building, as David had mentioned, is coming in municipal utility markets, because a municipal electric provider is a great source of profit to fund a failing broadband network. I did a very detailed analysis of the broadband system in Opelika, Alabama, for example. And when you do analyze the finances of these systems, I think you kind of have to do it the way I did, which is do a really deep dive in the financial documents that the city provides, assuming that they provide them in any detail, because there's a lot of cross-subsidy going on. So when you look at the finances of a broadband division, okay, that's not the whole story. There's money coming in from someplace else that you have to consider. And all these systems, whether it's Chattanooga or Opelika or Clarksville, they all put the debt of the system on the electric utility customer uniformly. And they may say they need, fiber to the home for, electric monitoring, but that's nonsense. And they've admitted to it, and Chattanooga admitted that that's not what its purpose was. Opelika doesn't even use it for that. And a study out in Wichita, I think it was, found that only about 3 to 5% of the cost of the fiber network can be reasonably assigned to the electric utility. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the debt of these systems are being assigned to electric utility customers. Opelika, like many systems before it and many systems that will follow, will eventually be sold for 10 to 25 cents on the dollar, and the massive debt will stay on the electric utility, as will the increase in utility prices that have occurred over the years. Opelika raised their rates by about 5% a month per customer to cover the cost of their failed network. I think there are some interesting legal issues here. I think there's probably an antitrust case against municipal provision of service. There's also a case, Larry Spywak discussed it in a perspective of ours, and he also discusses it in our forthcoming paper in the FCLJ, the American Railroads case. And that case found that if a government is serving as a competitor and a regulator, which every municipal broadband network does, I mean, you have to get permission, rights of way permission, and all sorts of regulation and franchise agreements and that sort of thing, then that's a violation of Fifth Amendment due process rights. Okay, I don't know how they get out from under that. They'd have to surrender either the network or surrender their regulatory authority. And I don't think they can do the latter. If that case were brought, and I don't know if a broadband provider, private broadband provider, would ever bring it. I mean, I suppose a city's constituents could bring it, or maybe in a key tam lawsuit. I don't know. That would be the end of municipal broadband altogether, because it's basically a violation of constitutional due process. I'll be interested to see if that ever comes to fruition. Some of the research I've done, and I recently came out with a paper earlier this week. Advocates of municipal broadband are always trying to show that municipal broadband networks charge lower prices than do their private counterparts, and they do so by looking at the prices in a single market, comparing AT&T and Comcast prices in Chattanooga, for example, to prices of Chattanooga's network, EPB. This is a stupid question economically. In any market, the prices have to be equal. The quality adjusted prices have to be equal among competitors. Otherwise, every single customer is going to go to the low price provider. So it's kind of an economically uninteresting question. And if you do it right, and they never do, but if you do it right, you always find that prices are very close to being equal between municipal providers and private providers, as you would expect from theory. The more interesting question is what if you compare markets with municipal providers to markets without? That's the economically relevant question. And I actually used the New America's survey data and found that prices in municipal markets are 13% higher than they are in markets that don't have municipal providers, and all that's on my website. I recently, last year, did a huge study on Chattanooga system looking for labor market outcomes. This is typically the argument that is made for municipal broadband, is that it's going to increase economic activity and improve jobs and attract businesses and that sort of thing. So I looked at Chattanooga. I could do a difference in difference analysis because the system started in 2009, 2010, something like that. And so I had census data before and census data after, and we could look to see if the labor market outcomes in Chattanooga changed relative to cities that didn't have a municipal broadband network. And we found absolutely nothing. I think we had 10 or more different labor market outcomes and just couldn't find anything. And it wasn't a result of a bad model. Chattanooga also had a car plant built in its far eastern region of the city in Ooltewah. And you can find almost exactly the number of employees hired by that plant in the data. So the model is very capable of detecting impacts, but there's just been no economic impact of that network. So I think we have to be a little skeptical. Now, that's not always true if you had a place that didn't have any broadband at all. And I can't say, I mean, they had broadband in Chattanooga before the city built a network and would have had it without the network. So my analysis would be limited to markets where the municipal system is overbuilding an existing system. But if you think that overbuilding a cable network is going to have some great economic benefit, it's just not going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is that no consumer can use a gigabit connection. I mean, it's a marketing gimmick for the most part, and it's just immaterial. So for the most part, you're spending millions of dollars to overbuild something that already exists and is available, which is, it might have some small price effect, but it comes at extremely high cost and 40 years of paying debt for a network that you're not going to own probably in 5 years.
Yeah, it's been really tough going through this, and like making the point about how long it takes for these to become usable, and many of the other issues, it's kind of, it's not helpful in increasing adoption. Of course, you talk about where there is a true market failure, that is someplace for government to likely step in. But a lot of what you all have been talking about is we're not seeing that that's how this is actually being used. A couple of other things I wanted to talk with you guys about, kind of like things that might work in better direction of government resources on this kind of stuff. Now, while ATR is not a huge fan of the Universal Service Program, it exists, so let's use it well. And in that way, in targeting to unserved, so there's been a lot of discussion about accurate broadband mapping, There's been, discussions about changing the eligible telecommunications carriers' requirements in order to participate in different auctions to reach unserved areas. And then there's also more talk about pole attachments. We actually had a question from a viewer talking about, owners of poles keeping competitors out. And I think we find that more often the investor owned or private owned pole attachments are actually utilities. And, one current issue that folks are running into is you have a bunch of different services connecting on those utility poles, and then you get to a point where the pole is past the end of its life, or you have a number of people on there. So the owner of the pole, let's say perhaps a utility company, needs to build a new one, and they put the entire cost on the newest connector to the pole, if that makes sense. So we're kind of talking through, how do those costs should be divided amongst all users, including the owner of the pole is one option for getting services out to customers who don't have them sooner. Also, the FCC has done a lot of approving new uses of spectrum. The TV white spaces band being put into use to reach rural areas. There have been launches of satellite networks like Starlink that plan to offer broadband. So, we've got some different competition ideas and things that may help folks. So any comments you guys have on things that might actually work to get broadband out to the truly unserved areas that really have a lot of need?
So, Katie, I think this is an all-above the approach, that we have to look at all these options. Pole attachments may not sound sexy and interesting, but they actually they are. I mean, going back to years ago in Tennessee when EPB tried to crowd out Comcast in Chattanooga, they wanted to raise the pole attachment fees. I think it was from $17 to $34 per pole. I mean, we see this, we see this in Tennessee, and then we have Sam Liccardo in California, a mayor who, this is kind of a different issue, but with 5G, wanted to charge companies $1,200 per pole to put their 5G box on it. Now, Indianapolis charged $50 a pole. Who has 5G now? Indianapolis. So it sounds like an awfully boring issue, but it really is something that cities and towns manipulate to crowd out the competition. And as you mentioned, we're seeing this now, and the FCC, I think, is going to be talking about this in August. I think there's going to be a comment period about what the role is, and should one company bear 100% of the cost of replacing these poles? Which, listen, this is not about pole replacement. This is about keeping competition out and trying to defer cost to, like you said, the last provider. And so, full disclosure, many years ago, I actually was a cable TV technician, and I would go up on a pole and fix it. So I actually have some firsthand knowledge of being up on a pole and seeing what it really looks like.
I appreciated that you brought up universal service, Katie, because I spend a lot of my time looking at that fund, and just boggles the mind that $10 billion are spent per year on broadband subsidies, taken from fees out of wireless bills and telecom bills. In a regressive manner, everybody gets billed that amount of money. And that goes into a $10 billion fund that is spent every year on broadband. And so I can see the disconnect that municipalities, people in their towns, they see that they don't have good service and they're frustrated. But at the same time, out of DC, a lot of money is going out for broadband. And so from this perspective, I think it's more government failure. There are a lot of regulations that hold back on deployment and how to fix the USF, the Universal Service Program, so that our dollars are being spent on broadband. So there is a disconnect. I feel like there's a lot of frustration that we don't have high speeds everywhere. And yet there's a huge pot of money that's being spent every year. So why isn't it working?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. As I talk about in the paper that's coming out next month or this month, I don't think any city wants to do this, really. Um, I mean, there are probably a few, but most of them really would rather somebody else build these networks, but they end up doing it out of desperation to some extent, and that's a pretty lousy place to be, to make a multi-million-dollar decision to build a network that's eventually going to fail and be sold for 10 cents on the dollar. But it to some extent it's a failure of state or federal policy. Despite the fact we spend billions of dollars on this, we had billions of dollars in the AARA for broadband, and people aren't feeling it. It kind of reminds me of cable regulation when I worked at the FCC, and somebody came up to me, a buddy of mine, and said, when are our cable rates going down? And this was towards the end of the thing. It had already been, all the regulation that was going to get done had been done. And I imagine people ask themselves, where's all this $1 billion going that we're spending on broadband? Now we're talking about spending $100 billion on broadband. That's going to be, I mean, if the past is any indication, and that's going to be a big waste of money. So I think we really need to, and I don't know if it's even possible for the government to get good at this, but we need to get better at allocating this money in ways that that actually have an impact on availability and adoption in some kind of quantifiable way, because what we've done in the past is not. And if you participated I participated in the ARRA process of getting that BTOP money deployed as an advisor, and it was a train wreck. It's not surprising to me at all that nothing happened. I mean, once the NTIA put net neutrality obligations on that money, anybody who knew how to build a network was out. And so you basically had people hustling for money that didn't really know what the hell they were doing, didn't have any customers, and didn't know where the network needed to be. And we got what we deserved. I mean, we've got, we spent, billions on community anchor institutions, and everybody's still complaining yesterday about students having to drive to McDonald's to get Wi-Fi. Well, what happened to all these community anchor institutions that we were supposed to wire up and have Wi-Fi? So it was not good. I think the biggest problem, though, always in building these networks is it's expensive. I mean, pole attachments can be a problem in places, sure. Government regulation is probably the second largest barrier to the construction of a broadband network. And I had a meeting at the GAO with a bunch of people in this business, and that's basically what they concluded. But it's expensive to build broadband networks. You got to dig up streets, you got to buy the stuff, the labor, all that, and then you got to know what the hell you're doing when you're done. And it's just a very, very difficult business. And a lot of times we want to say it's an easy business and there's lots of competition and all that. It's a hard business. There are not going to be a lot of people willing to spend billions of dollars deploying these networks, and there are not a lot of people willing to do that. And instead of criticizing all the time, we ought to be thankful somebody did, because it is not a business that you can get in and out of quickly or inexpensively. It's a very, very difficult and expensive business, and there are always going to be just a few people willing to engage in it.
Yeah, and I also love that you brought up the point about the 1 gigabit speeds and how that's sort of been a marketing ploy. It's one of the things that frustrates me and kind of adds to the cost of internet. We've got the government who has kind of been raising the bar on what qualifies as broadband, and I think what that really ends up doing is confusing customers and raising costs in the long run, because if people think they need 75, 1 gigabit, they need those kind of speeds, then they're going to spend more, when really lower rates are completely and totally adequate to run multiple devices and things like that. Do any of you guys have an idea of like the take up on gigabit services, or kind of the response on that? I've got a question that says, that was the main selling point of systems like Greenlight and Wilson and ABB in Chattanooga. So has that had any effect, George, Sarah? David, anything?
I think, well, I mean, for the systems that only offer a gig, which is a lot of the muni systems, I mean, of course, the take-up rate is okay. I know in Opelika, they had a terrible take-up rate for gigs until they just started making that the standard product. When people can get 100, 200 megabits a second, even less than that, they don't buy gig in high quantities. It's just so completely unnecessary. In Chattanooga, they used to have a program, I don't know if it's still running, trying to figure out what to do with 1 gigabit connections. And then meanwhile, you got Sandy trying to say, oh, now we're going to do 10 gig. You're like, but it's just silly. But that's not unreasonable when you think about government, right? Because the private carriers are thinking, what do we really need? And keeping up with that need over time. And then the government comes in and just throws out some number that's got nothing to do with nothing. I mean, there's a paper that a lot of times is cited for being favorable for municipal broadband by Robert Siemens that actually demonstrates the point econometrically. When the municipal systems or the threat of a municipal entry was there, the cable system would upgrade its network. Okay, he showed that. But he also showed that they never used the upgrades. So they're basically making investments in things that nobody wants. There's not sufficient demand to incur the marginal cost of cutting the thing on after you've incurred the fixed cost of upgrading your network. Okay, but I can appease the government, the local government, by making my network capable of something nobody wants. I mean, this is the problem. We have to respect the fact that the local governments have no idea how to run a broadband network, what the broadband business is, and how to do anything efficiently. It's just not their gig.
And I think COVID has, the need that has been expressed because of COVID and everyone being at home has shown that carriers do know what people need and have been prepared for that kind of the uptake in the usage at home. I mean, in many instances, it was a 30% increase in data usage that they saw. And in some places 75%, which is a huge increase. And our networks here in the United States were able to handle that increase in a residential demand, not business style demand, but residential demand, which I think is a huge testament. David, did you want to add something? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. Getting back to the gig service, what's interesting is we've asked this question of many systems, and they refuse to give us the numbers. We saw this anecdotally in Chattanooga years ago, and George can attest to this, is that there were a handful. And when I say handful, it was literally like 10 people had the gig service in Chattanooga because there's just not the desire to get it. And now they're holding the information very tightly, and they're not saying it's proprietary. Well, no, we're just asking for numbers. We're not asking for people's birthdays and their addresses. So they're holding it very tightly. But, getting back to the USF, there's unserved and there's underserved. And I think that at times bureaucrats, politicians get those two words confused, is that we need to get to the unserved because underserved is very subjective. And what does underserved mean? There's only 2 providers. We need a third. But yes, there needs to be a solution for unserved. In the USF, we have money that is doing that, and make sure it's spent wisely. And George referred to the stimulus bill that had billions of dollars in it. And I believe there was one community in Delaware where they had 200,000 homes. They had enough money to pass 300,000 homes. So it was this kind of just nonsensical things that the money was being spent on. And let's be clear, the private sector will always have more money to spend on these systems. It sounds counterintuitive. A government that spends $4 trillion a year, you're thinking, well, they have limitless funds. They really don't. I mean, they can only spend, and I hate to say only, but only tens of billions, a year, when the private sector has spent more than $1 trillion over the last 10 or 15 years to build these systems and keeps pumping money back into it. And companies pump money back into these systems, not worrying about who's controlling which house of Congress, and what bills coming up. So we have continual investment by the private sector. We have sporadic investment by the government, and that's why leaning on the private sector. And Katie, to your point, I mean, this pandemic has shown just, they were hit with a whammy. No one told them in January, hey guys, get prepared for this. No one told them that. It just happened. And, it's
Right.
part of a longer vision by the private sector and by the FCC and by Ajit Pai with net neutrality to make sure that they had the capacity to do this and that they had the ability to do it. So I think this was, a lot of bad things happened during the pandemic and are still happening, but the response by the private sector and working from home has been amazing. So, yeah.
On the gigabit point, I think part of the motivation, if I'm correct, is a gigabit of speed would attract investment of other kinds of businesses, right? Like put in a gigabit and you can build a technology cluster that will reinvigorate your town and bring businesses here. Well, the technology cluster theory has been, tested, and just because you build a tech cluster doesn't necessarily mean you'll be, a next booming city, firstly. And then secondly, I think in COVID, the trade-offs are becoming more clear. 25 megabits per second is great for homework and for getting connected to, people you want to stay connected to. And in times of survival, it might be better to have everybody get up to 25 rather than be concerned about the very upper end of speeds. So that's always going to be a trade-off when you talk about government money. Should we get to the unserved people 0 to 10 megabits first, and then let's worry about over 25, the underserved? So there are always going to be trade-offs about where to spend the money.
There are certainly always trade-offs, and it's all very interesting in talking about these issues, and we know there's still rural areas that need some help. We've also got a question asking if you guys are tracking any kind of legislation, maybe at the state level or any place else that maybe limits the ability of government-owned networks to start up, or anything along those lines coming forward. I know there were a number of states that had bills to that effect previously. Anything new?
I know there's a big movement right now, for example, of clearing the way for electric cooperatives. I mean, they're not municipalities. They're nonprofit collectives, basically, to build broadband networks. Some states have laws that prohibit that, or at least severely limit it. We've had laws, I know, in Mississippi and Alabama, both have had laws, and I think maybe Ohio and some other states. That's an active area, and of course, they're talking about $100 billion in Congress to deploy broadband. I did some math on that, actually, and if you look at the sort of the non-adopting, non-served area, your $100 billion is basically $12,000 per non-adopter, and it costs your average tax-paying household $1,300 to $1,400 in taxes to pay for it. It's a pretty pricey program, but we're right in this COVID thing, and spending money there doesn't seem to be any a hurdle to doing it.
Well, and it's been encouraging to see that year after year, the number of Americans without access to broadband continues to go down. It really depends on how you look at it. Getting back to kind of, the theory of looking at markets and how large a market is. When I look at broadband, I certainly include mobile in that idea as to what is and isn't broadband, and how can we get connected, where can we use hotspots, those sort of things. So we've got a question. This is kind of going to be the wrap up. Yeah, so we've got towns in rural areas that maybe have 51% coverage, but they don't qualify as unserved or underserved. because of those numbers. And, you know, we've talked through a lot of getting that unserved and underserved narrowed down correctly. Most recently going through, you know, we got that a better targeting, because it used to just be 10% unserved, and then folks would go in and for any of those subsidy programs kind of overbuild where there was already access. So what we really want to target is the underserved areas. And recently, the administration came out with a report saying, I think it was about 5.6% of Americans are without access. So we've gotten a lot closer to getting everyone there, but we're trying. We need to do better. So in these like towns that are less than a 10,000 population and getting internet service isn't attractive to ILECs, you know, what kind of option would be good there?
Well, that's what, you know, RDOF is supposed to be about. And if you had, you know, you get more funding into that, it's intended to target those areas. And this goes to the mapping issue too, is figuring out, you know, the FCC wants to limit the funding to areas that don't have coverage or don't have coverage of an adequate speed, but they're not real clear about what those areas are. You know, the data says we got 95% coverage. It's probably more like 90. 89, 88, something like that, because the data necessarily overstates the amount of coverage by the way it's constructed. But you've got to figure out how to get that done. I just keep thinking there's got to be a better way than a map to do this, because we've already spent $400 million or something on a map. It's the laughing stock of the industry, and that's a lot of money. You know, if you could create, you know, bounties or something like that, where private investors were paid to find unserved houses and serve them, or to come in and describe the boundaries of their network or pursue the boundaries of their network, make it worthwhile for them to do that, and then push the network out. And that seems to be the most economically sensible way, is to extend a network that already exists rather than to overbuild a network and then extend that network to areas that don't exist. I think the RDOF gets that right, of not subsidizing competition and overbuilding, or at least it wouldn't in a sensible framework where you're auctioning off to the lowest bidder. But that's the rub. I mean, that is the issue. How do you find the areas? And then where is the money going to come from to get them? We need. I don't know why we don't have a database solely devoted to here's the areas where we spent the money, and here's the number of households that are served and all that. It may be derivable from 477, but it's not directly derivable from 477. But I just wonder if there's not a better way to find unserved households than to spend $500 million mapping when 90 to 95% of what you're mapping is already covered. We only need to map about 10% of homes.
Which it seems like, I'm talking about RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, that does seem right now in the things, and removing that very old eligible telecommunications carrier requirement that means you have to provide a sort of copper wire type service as well, seems to be right now in the discussions the best way to target those areas, and as you said, extend networks that already exist rather than building new networks and then extending those. We are right up at time, so I want to go around and give you guys the opportunity for closing thoughts. We'll start with you, David. Closing thoughts.
Thanks, Katie. And I think that cities and localities should be very careful when they're considering building one of these networks. And again, watch out for the consultants. And as Sarah said earlier, is that providing a gig service is not going to make you a metropolis. You're not going to be the next Silicon Valley, because we heard that Opelika was going to be the next Silicon Valley if they got a gig service. So just beware of snake oil salesmen, I guess, is my final comment.
Thanks. Sarah?
I would also say, a lot of government money is going to be spent this year. You'll probably see more stimulus. And I studied the BTOP program from the Recovery Act in 2009. And, big sums of money sound really nice. But What really matters is outcomes, and I do hope that our federal dollars are spent wisely.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with David. And David, by the way, that was a really good study you guys came out with. I appreciate you doing that. It's very useful for empirical research. Is you just go in with your eyes wide open, whether you want to believe me or not. The track record is pretty strong that municipal broadband is going to fail. So have your eyes open. Know that people are trying to bamboozle you from every possible angle, and just realize that if you're going to do it, do it for the right reasons, and know you're going to be funneling money into this thing forever. That's just the way it's going to be. And when it comes to adoption, I just would encourage everybody to stop thinking in terms of universal adoption. That's not going to happen. Universal availability is unlikely to happen. Universal adoption is certainly not going to happen. We need to target a reasonable goal. The main reason by a long shot that people don't have broadband at home is because they don't want it. And that's just the reality. Some people don't want it. It can be for religious reasons or all sorts of things. Some people aren't stable enough ever to do that. So just, economics is an inoculation against wishful thinking. So I think it's important to try to temper your wishful thinking and realize that everything is like it is today for good reason. There's utility maximization going on under constraint, and this is the appearance that happens, and there's reasons for that appearance. It's not just because people are mean or inconsiderate or evil. It's because that's just the way it is.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm, closing out on that. Economics is an inoculation against wishful thinking. I really like that quote. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. I hope you all found this helpful. And thanks again. We will see you next time.
Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Katie.